That's right. FLAVORTOOTH is everyone. Every single one of us is FLAVORTOOTH. This is definitely not a cult. Welcome to FLAVORTOOTH. My name is Christopher Maute. Tonight, my guest is Lex Rozin, who teaches at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. He is a music theorist, so I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. Normally, I have my bass on, and the other person is all music-y, and we're doing stuff. We're going to be music-y, but we're going to be thought music-y.
Ooh.
We're going to be thought, and I have my bass right here. It's plugged in and ready to go. So if like an idea comes up and I'm like, I need to demonstrate it, I'm gonna. And if you have an instrument near you where you need to do that, then we will. But I kind of want this to be more conceptual, which is a little bit different than the previous ones. As much as I like demonstrations, when they're necessary, let's dig them out. And of course, we have Simon. Now, Simon is my producer / co-host. He helps guide my scattershot way of talking towards a structure that makes sense to other humans.
Under the thumb.
How you doing tonight, Simon?
I'm very good. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to meet Lex as well, and I'm looking forward to this conversation immensely, and I'm looking forward to learning some stuff. So it should be great.
Yeah. So, Lex, what you're going to find out is, even though I kind of have positioned Simon as the handler, the babysitter, if you will, he also is very well versed in philosophy, and he is a musician. And so if he comes at you with a question that you're just like, whoa, this guy kind of knows what he's talking about, don't be surprised. He might have some deep cuts.
Yeah.
The question that I'm going to ask is the same question I ask everybody, and it is, do you think that music evokes emotion? And why or why not?
And how many words am I allowed in my...
You can go, well, I only want to spend about 60, 90 minutes total talking.
Right.
So if that's a pie chart, let's let it sliver 10 minutes.
10 minutes. I'm not going to use that much, but
all right.
I was wondering if I needed my forced choice response here, and I had to say yes or no. And
There's
go
three alternative forced choih. It's either yes, no, both. For alternative.
My answer to every question, given that choice, is both.
Oh yeah. Oh, you're taking the Taoist position.
Oh, you got to take the Taoist position.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's the middle road. No, but seriously. So how would you answer that?
But it really, I would say yes is my ultimate answer to that. And as always, I complicate things, but it really depends on what you mean by emotion.
Okay.
And when some people ask that question, does music evoke emotions? They're afraid to answer yes because there's this feeling like if I say yes, it means every single time it evokes emotion. Or if I say music is sad, I always mean that it makes me sad when I listen to it. And
I never thought of it from that angle.
Right, and I don't agree with that. I do believe music has the ability to evoke emotions, and beyond anything else that I can cite, simply ask billions of people around the world, and they will agree with the fact that music does elicit emotions in them. And it's actually a very, very small minority in this world, mostly scholars who doubt it for one reason or another, which we might get into. But to me, I want to rely on the data that people tell you, whether it's in an experiment or just talking to people on the street, say, of course music does. And
all right. Well, hold on. So I'm gonna stop you. I'm gonna start pushing back right at that point. That's the pressure point that I want to play with. Well, some people think that self and free will exists, but academically, some people would argue that both the self and free will are illusions. So couldn't it be, using that same analogous paradigm, to just say, well, that music falls in that category as well, right? It's not evolutionarily significant. It's merely a spandrel. It's See,
Oh,
I
you
knew
just
I was
threw
going to
down.
get you.
You just
It's
threw down
merely a
there.
spandrel. It is merely a spandrel. It is a leftover
The
linguist.
pie chart just
Stephen
expanded.
Stephen Pinker has laid this to rest easily with the language. No, he hasn't.
No
Or
way.
how
Not
the
even
mind works. All right. Well. So, would
That's
you be able
another
to lay
step.
out the? Would you be able to lay out the auditory cheesecake theory?
Sure.
Okay, so this is the Steven Pinker argument that I was just
Yeah.
busting his chops with. All right, so
Right.
what is this?
And this is actually very important to me. This is gave rise to a class that I teach at Westchester, and the theme is auditory cheesecake.
Nice.
And it's meaningful for me not only because the subject is interesting and says so much about music and all of what we do as humans. But I got to hear Steven Pinker speak the year that How the Mind Works came out. He was speaking to the Society of Music Perception and Cognition up at MIT as the keynote speaker. And he said to a huge room full of music scholars that ultimately music doesn't matter in that sense of evolutionarily speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave rise to a lot of scholarship. Although I, like many people out there who responded to Pinker, it's hard to convince even yourself that music has some true evolutionary purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I think the argument for music is just as strong as something such as, for example, language. And so many psychologists and evolutionary biologists will say, of course, language. Yeah, come on, we needed that, right? And there are plenty of people, and I would put myself in this camp, who believe that music and language actually were one thing long ago.
Okay.
And
so
they
the music language theory.
Yeah.
So which posit, because there's many different posits, so that means that there was a proto music built into the proto language, and that they evolved in parallel, because there are different ways to view that as well, how language and music developed. Now we're already getting into weeds. We're already getting into evolution, and I still want to define what emotions are. Not that we're not going to get back to these.
No, I got you. But I think that's the big thing is what you think emotions are.
Okay.
Because
so I can answer that, but I want you to know, but explain why it's important.
It's important because if you define it, an emotion very narrowly, and this is true when you define anything, if you define it very narrowly, not much fits into the category. And so if you define emotion very narrowly, chances are musical emotion might not fit in so well.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on what you're willing to encompass in the word emotion, that will define whether music can evoke them. Right?
So I go with the garden variety, right? If for an operational definition. So in psychology of emotion research, it is there are a certain set of emotions that are commonly referred to as the garden variety emotions. And the reason why that's important in it is because depending on which emotions researcher you're looking at, what they consider basic emotions might change, but the overlapping ones that are just in everyone's theory, the garden variety emotions, are the happy, sad, anger, fear, surprise, on the edge there, disgust.
Disgust.
Right?
Gotta have disgust.
You have to have disgust. Hey, I'm not. Oh, hey, do not accuse me. Do not falsely accuse me of anything. So, I forgot what I was going with that.
You were going with the basic or the garden variety emotions.
So those are the garden variety emotions. So when people talk about emotions colloquially, I think they're mostly talking about the garden variety emotions. So I am in my argument that music does not evoke emotions. That's one of the moves that I pull. And you're such a scientist for just explicitly saying that, like, oh, the more narrowly you define something, the more difficult it becomes to, right? It's just like, yes, but that's the goal. The goal is to narrowly define it off the table to make the statement absurd.
Well, yes, but some people do that. And I think it's absurd, right? So, but the problem is, like, let's take that, a very narrow definition of emotion, to the point where you say, music doesn't evoke those. Someone else would say, so all the feelings that I'm experiencing when I listen to music are not those things, but they're still things. They're still legitimate experiences. And I don't care what we call them.
There you go.
We still have to explain it. how does the music do this? Why does the music do this? Why do we care about it, right? All those things still hold as interesting questions, whether we call them emotions, moods, feelings, affect, whatever you want, terms you want.
Or you don't label them at all. It's still an experience. Even if you don't label it, it's still the experience.
Exactly. And I think that's where, in that idea, connecting it back to that evolutionary thing again with music and language, perhaps kind of being one thing long ago and then bifurcating. Music and language each are very good at different things. They clearly overlap in some ways, but music seems to be much better than language at emotion stuff.
Yes.
And part of that is that our linguistic terms, whether it's emotion or sadness or surprise, whatever, don't do a very good job at describing our musical experiences.
No.
And you can't just say, oh, yeah, I'm sad right there in measure 27 of Strange Fruit or something like that. I mean, it's a dynamic experience that defies linguistic labels most of the time.
So this is where I kind of throw the curveball in, right? Because so my argument would be, yeah, it's not garden variety emotions, but it is an affective response, right? So if we want to maintain technical terms, right? Because it's an experience regardless, even if it doesn't have labels. But if we're going to play the game of labels, let's start with just an umbrella term of affective responses under which garden variety emotions exist. But other things do as well, like more diffuse affective responses that don't necessarily have names and are fleeting, like moods. You know what I mean? And then there's aesthetic responses that I would consider an affective response that music definitely taps.
Yeah.
Like purposefully.
Yeah.
But I think that the mechanism of the device that's doing the most work in music to relay emotion is tension and release.
Oh, you're speaking my language now.
Okay, well then, so you tell me why tension and release is important then.
Why is it important?
Like, well, why? So if I'm singing your song,
yeah,
what's that song sound like?
Well, I think, first of all, we often, as we're now talking about, when we talk about emotion, whether musical or otherwise, we get bogged down in these words.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's got to be sadness or joy or one of the others. And as you said, so much fits in between the cracks and is never going to fit comfortably. But one thing that that psychologists like to do is try to figure out what the essential dimensions are of some experience. And with emotion, they like to talk about really two dimensions. One is the hedonic dimension, like positive, negative.
Mm-hmm.
So anger is negative and joy is positive. But then also the degree, right? Often talked about as arousal, but just sort of the intensity of your emotional experience, which I think gets pushed to the side way too much. Including, like, we only talk about sadness. We hardly ever talk about grief, which is an incredibly important, if I'll use your term, affective response,
okay.
And one that shows up in music as well. But so I think the intensity is so important, and the intensity, that word tense, intensity, it's related to tension. And I will say, as a music theory teacher, when we teach these kind of often abstract concepts like, here's this chord, we call it a secondary dominant. Okay, move on. We don't talk enough about this idea of tension and resolution or relaxation, whatever you choose to use as the opposite. And it's, to me, the absolute basis of our experience with music and with a lot of the world, frankly, not just the aesthetic realm, but just day-to-day living.
Yeah, and from a psychological perspective, like the ability to manipulate emotions via tension and release is like a hack. It's like a psychology hack. Like you were just talking about secondary dominance, and without getting too deep into the water, too deep into the weeds. There is a classic. I'm gonna demonstrate something.
Oh yeah, here we go.
This is one of those moments that needs to be demonstrated. So I want to put a pin in why I'm doing this, so that when I'm done, I'm not left speechless. So, because that happens more often than I would like it to the older I get. So we're going to do secondary dominance as an example of tension and release. And my point is that it is a psychology hack. Okay. So, let's see. I think I'm affected here. Yeah, I don't need that many effects.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. I got my funk. My funk patch going on here. But clean it up.
Yeah, you got a little Stevie Wonder ready to happen there. Huh?
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
So, if we're gonna in music, how's my level? Can you hear what I'm playing? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just gonna play some basic chords. This is actually tuned as a tenor bass. So it's a 5-string bass, but instead of it being B, E, A, D, G, it is E, A, D, G, C. So it is the top 5 strings of a 6-string bass. So the chords sound pretty. So in Western music, we're used to resolutions in music with consonants and dissonance, which are just tools for tension and release. So this is a consonant chord. Isn't that pretty? Isn't that so nice?
Oh,
right?
That's another conversation. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, come on. Now, in our culture.
In our culture. Most of my students would say that's dissonant.
This is okay. Well, I'd like to have a discussion about. Yeah. Let me get this demo out, and then I want to.
I'm with you because I love jazz too. But
oh, because I'm throwing a 7th in there. What
that's
if
right. You put the 7th in there.
I smell you. So what if I something super vanilla?
There you go. Good old major triad.
Okay, so we got a major triad. Now, if I want that to be the sweet spot. It sounds nice enough by itself, but you can sweeten it up by prefacing it with some tension so that when you get to it, it's even sweeter because you've released that tension. And those chords are called dominant chords. So if that's the target chord, I can go. And you hear that resolution to our ears and our culture denotes tension and release. So using that concept of that means tension and that means release, well, now we can play with it. And if we're going to play a chord progression that is, let's say, I'm going to use some numbers that are based on the scale. And the scale is an 8-note scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's a 7-note scale. And the 8th note is an octave. Okay, so if I'm playing a chord progression based on the 1st, 6th, 2nd, and 5th chords of that key center, C, it would be C, A minor, D minor, G7, C. But that D minor, I want to create tension and release it with that chord. So I'm just going to preface it with a dominant chord. Now, the chord before it's supposed to be an A minor, but if I just make it a dominant, it resolves. So I'm throwing tension and release dominant resolutions within a chord progression. So instead of it being, it's... Okay, so that's the secondary dominant concept. And my point is that this is a psychology hack because of the way I just explained it. It's if you're clever enough, you can create tension in somebody and release it. And by doing that, have either an affective or aesthetic response evoked in them. And that's weird that we can predictively, reliably do that. Okay, that's my point.
Yes.
You said that 7th chords are dissonant and not consonant. So let's go to
I said
that.
they're more, I didn't, so to me,
students.
dissonance is a completely relative phenomenon. I mean, you can look in the ear and there are intervals that create dissonance in the ear. We can see that, not see that, but we can tell that people believe that. But dissonance is a relative thing. For you and me, that major 7th chord that you played,
Yeah.
it sounds stable. Sounds like it's released. If you listen to jazz, that's what it sounds like, right? It's a tonic chord. It's the place you want to end with. It's home. But I will tell you, most of my students who don't know jazz at all, they hear that chord and they're like, hold it, it's got to go somewhere. So there's a component of it kind of being hardwired and a component of it that is acculturated, right? That is, we learn these things as well. And to me, that's one of the reasons that jazz is so intriguing, is that even the most restful sound has some tension to it.
Yeah.
Could you just,
sorry, Simon, I was just going to bring you in. Go ahead.
Thank you. Could you just explain what most of your students kind of music they play then, just to give some contrast to jazz?
Yeah, good question. We always have a few jazzers here and there who are the ones with the best ears. And so there's a split. We have a bunch of musicians who are classical musicians. The pianists tend to be classical musicians. And then we have a lot of marching band. That's a big deal at Westchester, the marching band.
Right.
They're really good. We have a really good marching band. And so sometimes the music they know is whatever they've played in marching band their whole lives, and that slice of popular music that was around between 8th grade and 12th grade before they got to us at Westchester. So when I play Stevie Wonder for them, I might as well be playing Mozart. I mean, it's so beyond what they're used to. Maybe it's their parents' music. Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I see, and that's down to scale, right? The choice of scales that they choose to express themselves within.
Oh, certainly. And when we teach scales in their very first semester of their first year, and we do major and minor scales, of course, and then we start introducing blues scales, and we get into modes, different kinds of modes and octatonic scales and things like that. You can see there's some of them are not buying in. This is not what they signed up for, but they need to learn this stuff. If they want to do what they want to do, which is often play quite a variety of music in the end, or compose film music or music for video games, they got to know all kinds of different music and materials. So, yeah.
And so, Simon, a point that I was going to raise with you is something I was hoping you could relate to. So Lex was saying that jazz seems complicated or more dissonant to people who are not used to hearing sevenths in chords. And I was trying to reduce that. I was trying to find something that I could relate to that makes sense to. And so here's the question I have for you. And Lex, I don't know if you grew up playing guitar or whatever, but this is a very guitar question. So power chords. How many songs did you learn in power chords?
Yeah, a lot.
Right. And so with the distortion and the power chords, when you would throw a third on top of it, wouldn't it just rub? It doesn't have that pure, come on, it's a fifth, it's a perfect fifth.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot. I mean, one of the things that I started with was, of course, Richie Blackmore, who's famous for playing fourths with distortion. And so, there's a lot of indistinguished. I mean, thirds just didn't get played. AC/DC, you don't hear thirds very much at all. Thirds just are not, they're too colorful, basically. They're not raw enough, I would say. But actually, that's what attracted me to the music. And I'd heard a lot growing up. My father was into jazz music, and I listened to all his records. My mum was into classical music. So Holst and Wagner and Stravinsky was a standard thing before I picked up music to play myself. And as soon as I started playing it myself, I did it by ear. And of course, the easiest thing to do is to pull out Smoke on the Water and off you go. And of course, that's what influenced my early thing, going to see bands like, whatever, Van Halen, Black Sabbath, and that kind of thing.
Whitesnake.
Not so much Whitesnake, but that's another point. I lived down the road from the drummer and the guitar player, Mickey Moody. And he used to come into the music shop that I worked in a lot. So, yeah, good guys. And we actually had the drummer audition for our band as well, the Whitesnake drummer audition for our band. But he was too good. He was too good. So I had to say no. Anyway, back to the conversation. Sorry to distract.
That was a great example, I thought, though, Chris.
What's that?
I thought the distortion, there are a lot of people who listen to music with distortion and they can't deal with it. Mm-hmm. Right now, if they give it time, they get used to it. and perhaps be able to hear a lot. I had this experience. I had a thesis student who did his thesis project in my little office once a week. He would come in, no windows, and we would listen to Swedish death metal.
I'm sorry.
And I mean, I can't say that it's on my exercise playlist, but I don't hate it anymore. I mean, was able to get past the veneer of screaming and into some pretty wickedly interesting things, especially with rhythm and meter in that music.
Yes.
And so I think you have to almost have some time to buy in. And then, you know, it's the same thing with jazz. A lot of people react to it negatively, but then given some time, you know, you start with the easier stuff and then you work your way up.
Well, I'd like to use that to springboard into talking about teaching music to non-musicians. You had mentioned that some of your students are in band, some of them are classically trained, you have the jazzers, but you also have students that are not musicians at all. They're psychology majors. And I can relate to you because I was telling you before we broadcast, and I'll just make this a shorter version of this for the audience. I taught psychology of music and spent so much time focusing on the material, it didn't dawn on me I was teaching it to people who didn't have music fundamentals. They were non-musicians, so I couldn't refer to scales, names, note names, what is a sharp, what is a flat, like the basics that go into a music theory course, the kinds of courses that that Lex teaches. It didn't dawn on me that that would be a prerequisite, that I should spend some time on that. So because I sucked at it so bad, I want to teach that course again, and I want to do it better. So I want to know what recommendations you have for teaching music to non-musicians, for teaching these concepts.
Yeah, it depends what you're teaching, right? What specific course. You know, at Westchester, we offer tons of courses. A lot of the music history courses, history of film music or, you know, history of jazz, something like that. And so those teachers have to adjust with non-majors out there. So they're not going to be talking about diminished scales when they're talking about jazz. They're just going to get into some other concepts. I teach a class on music and evolution, and then I can just avoid the problems of music notation and music theory and such.
Yeah,
but
you can focus on the experience in a class like that.
Exactly. And that's what's so intriguing about music is, on the one hand, as you're talking about, you need this technical language to really discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's something that everyone on the planet understands.
Yeah, there's an intuitive, right? So Jeff Berlin, who is a famous electric jazz bass player, let me rephrase that, jazz electric bass player, he had a very controversial stance in teaching. He's like, don't play to a metronome. Metronomes don't make people's rhythms better because people have internal rhythm. And he used to demonstrate it, like at his workshops. He'd be like, anybody, come here, play this without a metronome. And they would just play it in time, and he'd solo on top of it, and he'd be like, we're born with an internal clock. Anyway, so that's a little exaggeration of a few words.
Right. But that's what's so crazy about it, right? We all understand it, and yet to become an expert in any kind of music, there seems to be this language, this nomenclature, this training that is required. And it's a little bit odd. So in like a psychology of music course, you run into these problems where, on the one hand, you have students who know a lot of this technical language, and you can refer to things like, this is a major scale, and they know what that is. They can probably sing it, they can play it, and so on. And then you have people who just can't. And negotiating that is not simple. And I certainly, when I screw it up, I err on the side of the non-musicians. That is, instead of talking above them, I'd rather talk below the musicians a little bit. And what I try to do is get the musicians involved in a different way. For example, hey, and this doesn't work so well with virtual learning, but in person, bring your instrument and you're going to help me demonstrate something, right? Let's talk about timbre. And so I got a saxophonist in front of me and I got a violinist in front of me. Let's talk about that. And I want the saxophonist to change the timbre. I want you to sound like Dexter Gordon. Now I want you to sound right, like Eric Dolphy or something, someone totally different. And so that's where I've gone with it. The problem ultimately is, who is the class for?
Yeah.
And my class is supposed to be for music therapy majors. They are musicians.
I want to
And
talk to you
so
about music
I
therapy
have
too.
to actually really gear it towards them and say to the other students, you're going to have to do some catch up here.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if I get to teach that course again, I should treat it like, and no offense to USA Today, but I should USA Today it and make it very human interest, right? Because for me, like, I'm a cheerleader for psychology. I think the topic is just so, it is the handbook to humans. Like, that's what studying psychology is to me. So, like, I find it fascinating and I want others to. And I think that psychology, music psychology, is quadruply fantastic because there are music illusions, auditory illusions that we can play with and talk about and stuff. But to get mired down, like when somebody's like, oh, what is a blah, blah, blah scale? To pause that momentum and be like, so the octave is broken down into, see, oh, it's like, come on.
Exactly. Right. So the core of the field of psychology music, kind of where it came from in at least the last 50 years, is the real nitty gritty music perception and cognition. What are we hearing with this melody and this chord progression and that rhythm? And that's the stuff that's the hardest for the non-musicians to understand. So I also move it away from that conversation. I talk about it very generally, but then let's talk about emotion, because that's something that people can latch onto. They can latch on to music therapy and understand what that's about. They can get into certain topics like that, and you don't have to get lost in the technical language of music. But I, so I studied with Eugene Narmore, who was a student of Leonard Myers,
Okay.
and that has it's now deep inside me uh, to work with the implication realization model, which is a model of music perception and cognition, how we hear music, how it affects us. And I can't really talk about that in that class of all places because, boy, it gets really technical. I mean, even the musicians run away from that because it's so intense and at times very difficult. So it's a frustrating kind of course to teach.
Interesting. So I want to take that topic as a springboard to another topic. So you had mentioned that you one fun way to teach music to non-musicians is through a course like the evolutionary implications. So let's talk about auditory cheesecake for a hot
Go
second.
back to the cheesecake again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're back to the cheesecake. We're getting right there back to it.
Yeah.
New York style. So would you like to explain auditory cheesecake?
Sure.
Okay.
So yeah, Steven Pinker, who is, I guess, probably the most famous linguist in the world. Fair enough to say he's at Harvard now.
Well, Chomsky's still alive.
Well, Chomsky's still alive, yeah. So we'll give him his props there. So Steven Pinker, in his book How the Mind Works, uh, tried to deal with, given the title, everything that defines us as human. And so he had to engage with all sorts of subjects that, frankly, were outside of his home field of linguistics. And one of them was music. And he argued in that book that music is auditory cheesecake, which is to say, it is delicious. We absolutely love it. We are designed to love this stuff. But if you took it away from us suddenly, while we might be sad, we would be, it wouldn't harm us as a species in any way. That is, we don't have music because it protects us from predators or helps us protect our young or helps us get food out there. So that was his argument. And by the way, that was disagreeing with Charles Darwin, who also wrote about music.
Yes, he was using music as a counterexample to something that evolves. Right? He was like, language definitely came from evolution. We need language, unlike music. right? Like that's how he framed it almost. It was just like
Yeah.
an example of something that we absolutely use but we don't need is
Right.
music.
Right. And the idea, he loves music. It's not that he doesn't think
Oh
it's a
no.
great thing, right? He just believes that it did not develop for some real purpose. It was an accident that, picks on these pleasure centers in our brain, just like cheesecake. So we've been designed to love sugar.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's
so we don't
yeah.
need cheesecake, but when we eat it, that part of our brain lights up and we're like, yes, that's fantastic. And so he was seeing music in the same way.
Yeah.
Now, he was coming from a very, very Western classical music perspective. So that was one issue there. But there's been a lot of responses to him in the last
and
20 plus years.
Just to add a little bit more detail, the cheesecake thing is particularly fun because you can play games with it like, well, there's no such thing as a cheesecake tree, right? So it's not like something that we evolved to enjoy, but it combines all of these things that we did evolve to need and enjoy, like fats and sweets and salties and stuff like that. And that's what music does, right? It takes like the prosodic envelope of the voice, especially when people are being emotional, and it structuralizes it so that, at least that's the argument. I'm trying to steel man the argument as best as I can.
Yeah.
But so that's the auditory. So music is nothing but auditory cheesecake. It's like a spandrel, kind of like, and if you're not familiar with that, it's just like a vestigial part of things that are important. It just kind of is left over.
Yeah. And so the idea is that we'll get rid of it at some point in our future because it takes up it. I mean, anthropologists don't like Pinker's argument because they look around the world and they see every culture having music and spending an enormous amount of time and energy on it, which seems like a really bad idea for something that doesn't matter for us. I mean, in a deep evolutionary way. But Pinker's idea is that it'll disappear because we just can't afford it in our futures. So, yeah, that stirs up some real serious emotions, real emotions. Certainly, in my students, I see it when I present that idea. I ask them to respond, and they don't like that at all. They don't like
because it's like somebody's telling you that you're being fooled, right?
Right.
It's like somebody's it's like which I do on purpose. Like when I'm teaching my sensation perception class, I start it with and end it with and pepper it with the mantra, we are not in direct contact with external reality, right? So like I'm purposely trying to, throw the curveball to get you off center so that you can kind of appreciate these sensation perception phenomena and stuff. But yeah, I can see how this would knock people off their center because like music and emotion and its significance just seems intuitive. But I never hear people like break it down. Let me rephrase that. I rarely hear people when they're talking about it break it down into the cultural evolution versus biological evolution and the co-evolution of the two, right? Because there are plenty of arguments within music perception and musicology that it is the way that biological evolution co-evolves with cultural evolution, and how they move forward. That's where different things become important that you can't really frame as just a biological evolution thing, like fire, right? Music would be put into that category for the people that are proponents of this. Am I doing it justice?
Yeah, that seems
okay. Now, I'm assuming that your handle is that it is evolutionarily important, but are you speaking from a biological or a cultural evolution perspective?
So, well, I would clarify my handle first of all. That I'm in the. I have no idea ultimately, and we never will know. But it's a really
diplomat.
Yeah, it's really a fun thought experiment, and I do feel, as I said to you earlier, I think the case for music being both a biological and a culturally evolutionary important human phenomenon, the case for music is just as good for just about anything else. And now it's gotten to the point we even finally have gotten, we've found some neural networks up there in the brain that seem to only respond to music and not other kinds of sound, including language. So there is more and more evidence that this goes back deep in our history. Um, exactly what the nature of it is whatever it meant to us all those millennia ago. Does it still mean the same thing to us now? Or has it changed its purpose? Is it now cheesecake and it wasn't before?
Mm.
You know, there are all kinds of possibilities. And there's no question, by the way, that Pinker's right to some degree. A lot of music we do is cheesecake.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not simply
or
that
bubble gum. You know, choose your confection.
Exactly, right? There's bubblegum is a great one, right? There is not too much cheesecake pop, but maybe there should be, right?
That's for a refined palate.
Right.
That's
exactly.
on your way to flan pop.
Ooh. Yes, that would be good. I usually use
and you're also a cook. I should
yes,
point out.
I am.
You are also very, very steeped in flavors, cooking, and
right.
gastronomy.
So, in fact, in that course, I show over the course of the semester about 800 different versions of cheesecake, as done mostly by the most creative chefs in the world. And they don't look like cheesecake, but they are. And so I describe what's in them. And then if we get to the end and we're actually together, I bring them cheesecake that I've made. You know,
good on you.
That's the crown. It's not auditory cheesecake. I tell them, don't push it in your ears. Not a good idea. But
all right, so hold on a second. If we're going to talk food, we're going to talk food. So quickly, tell me what the secret is to your cheesecake.
It depends what kind. You know,
which do you go to? Let's go to your go-to. Are you doing the refrigerated one? Or are you doing the baked one?
I'm baking. I'm definitely baking. There's no question.
So how do you prevent the eggs from breaking when you're baking?
You mean the top from cracking? Is that what you're talking about?
No, because if you don't do it right, the cheesecake can the egg in the cheesecake can kind of separate.
Yeah. Right. The key to me is sort of the slow and low mantra in a lot of cooking. So when you bake it in the oven, you're baking it in a water bath.
Thank you. That's what I was waiting.
The bain marie, and so that steaming action it moderates the temperature so that there's not as much differential when it's baking, and you get an even one. Still might get some cracks on the top. But that's why you put the sour cream topping on and then some raspberries or whatever you like.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Yeah. All right. Yeah. There's no mistakes. There's just reasons for more fun.
Exactly.
I like it. All right. So now we got the cheese. Go ahead, Simon.
Well, no, I'm when you're ready to get back to music, go for food. And when you're ready to get back to music, just bring me in first.
We're going back. We're going back to music.
Oh, we are. Okay, so this auditory cheesecake. When you say cheesecake, that sounds to me manufactured, right? Some semblance of manufacture. In which case, I'm wondering, are we talking maybe about not necessarily the components of music, but actually the way it's put together? So something like, what do they call it? The 12-note scale or even tempered. I've forgotten the last word because it's been many years since I've thought about it. Is that what we're talking about, the cheesecake? The fact that these notes have been shifted slightly in order to blend together in a way which makes a nicer, cohesive sound.
I think that's an interesting point. I don't think he was specifically addressing well-tempered music. I think that he was specifically talking about the components that go into what makes music fun. But that's an interesting way of looking at it, because music has become more processed, right? If we're gonna think of cheesecake as the ultimate processed confection, then over time, music itself has become more and more processed. I mean, we could talk about auto-tune,
right?
Yeah. So I mean, humans don't sound like humans anymore. So I mean, but that's not all music. So that's the problem here. Like, you know, because we're speaking about music and we're painting it with this brush of synthesis or syntheticness, that doesn't mean all music is going towards this. And also, that's these directions towards synthetic, I think, are fun variables for future music makers to either rebel against or use in their own music, right? Because, so for instance, if we're going to go into this, if we're going to talk about like the synthesis, fake nature of music, one of my favorite new artists is Billie Eilish. And it's because her music incorporates things that are mistakes in the studio. And instead of them being mistakes that you try to fix, they're exaggerated and they're used as an element.
Yeah.
Look, I'm going to compress the voice until it breathes. And for those of you that use compression, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you that don't, just know that you're over compressing. You're doing it too much if it breathes. Nope. I'm going to do a stack of vocal tracks that are over compressed on purpose because it gives you this weird, cool, particular sound. So everything that was wrong is now right. But
Yep.
again, that's how
And that's more of the cultural evolution there. That's
yes.
the right, like style evolves at it in everything. So you're talking about now how we produce sound, right?
Yes.
But that's true, you know, for the history of music. It changes because we are by our nature creative. Not necessarily all of us, but in general we are. And when we are used to something, whether it's a kind of music or food or whatever, people start playing with it. They play with the rules. They start doing different things. And then some things work, some things don't. And then the next generation goes, yeah, those rules you were breaking, terrible. I'm going to do it a different way, right? And it just keeps going in different directions. And that's what makes it exciting. So I love those things. I know some people listen to recordings, getting back to jazz, of like Thelonious Monk playing piano. And they're like, why is this piano so out of tune? And there might be reasons for that. Like that's what they had. That was what's exactly. But I think it worked for him, right? It was a unique sound, and it just, to me, it's magical. And those things go in and out, right? Distortion, it's another thing. Came in, it went out, it's back
Eddie
in.
Van Halen purposely he purposely had his higher strings detuned and out of tune because it just gave a certain chunk to his chords. But it's using Thelonious Monk with an out of tune piano. An out of tune piano emphasizes the vibe that Thelonious was going for, because for those of you not in the know, Thelonious was deep into dissonant, like minor seconds while he was playing. So an out-of-tune piano, he probably thought was like the best toy in the world.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to play with dissonance now. Oh, you wait, watch me go. So that makes sense. So Simon, did you have something to add? Because I wanted to kind of move on to music therapy.
Okay. Just briefly then, if I made the point I was really kind of getting to was this: where does the evolution change into the or biological change into the cultural? Where's that difference for you?
Have fun answering that.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I mean, yeah, hard to tell because we just don't have enough data over the course of the millennia. Unfortunately, we didn't get any brain scans done a couple 100,000 years ago. Yeah, I mean, you know, culture is constrained by our biology. And so where exactly the line is between those things.
Right. Okay, let me give you a bit more you can hook on, which is to say I'm interested in the role that rhythm plays in the biological development of music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm very into Indian music, and as such, rhythm is a very crucial part of that music. It's
absolutely,
it's the foundation of it more than the scales are. So for me, you know, that's really the entry point from biology into music. And that's what's appealed to me so much over the years, is this sense that timing gives me a much more intuitive feel for things around me and doing things, action.
I think synchrony, I think rhythm. I mean, when it comes right down to it, if we're going to talk about the evolution of music, we have to start with rhythm and what it did to synchronize a group cohesion.
Yep.
Or how synchrony helped with group cohesion.
And how unique we are at that. You know, our closest relatives in the evolutionary tree can't do basic rhythmic things. Some species can, like parrots. It seems to be those who have some vocal learning ability, who can actually, like, you know, hit out a beat to music.
Yeah, purposely.
And purposely, yeah. And so it's to me, I agree with you, Simon, that it's rhythm is so fundamental, and I think it's unfortunately in our culture pushed down below pitch stuff, chords and scales and things, and it shouldn't be because I know whether it's classical music or it's jazz or pop music, whatever. When I really like a tune, rhythm and meter are at the core of it, playing with that. And that's, I'm with you. I love North Indian classical music. Is some of the greatest music in the world. Tabla is perhaps my favorite instrument in the world. It is the instrument that I failed most miserably at trying to learn. I couldn't even sit in the position for 5 minutes. Yeah. Have you seen that commercial that uses that now?
Yeah, I'm so impressed.
Boom!
I'm so impressed.
I don't pay attention to commercials, and I was watching college basketball, and that came on, and I dropped everything, and I was, what's going on? I'm gonna buy it, right?
Oh yeah, it was like so are you familiar with Trila Gurtu? Jazz musician John McLaughlin.
Okay.
In the 90s, he was McLaughlin when he was Electric was Mahavishnu Orchestra because he got started with Miles, and then he got into like this acoustic phase in the 90s. And as a drummer, he had a drummer named Trila Gurtu, who was in a band called Oregon. I think they were on ECM, and he is an Indian percussionist. And so in the middle of their show, he and John McLaughlin are just trading tabla syllables.
Amazing.
And it's the best.
It is the best. Some of my favorite, the musician I've probably seen more often than any other live is Zakir Hussain, the tabla.
Oh, yeah. I've seen him a number of times. Yeah.
And when he does the Masters of Percussion thing, where it's either like just the best percussionists from all around India, or it's working with Giovanni Hidalgo playing congas, or I saw him with what's his name, the drummer from Journey,
Steve Smith.
Steve Smith, yeah. And Steve Smith had his kit up there, and they're doing it together, and then they start doing it back, doing all the syllables back and forth, and it just was like awesome. And then he's playing the same piece on his drum kit, just amazing. I think that rhythm is underrated. It is very likely a major reason why we have music. This idea of synchrony and working together, and it to me helps define when music is really great. To me, like a group like the Beatles, obviously one of the most successful groups ever. Their tunes are just more interesting rhythmically than a lot of other stuff that's going on, and I find that true now. Like what defines great hip hop to me is the stuff that's really playing with rhythm and meter in fun ways that just keep you off balance in the way that Zakir Hussain would.
Right. I'm glad that artists like Jacob Collier and there's a whole subgenres that he taps into. They're playing with like shuffle, right? Instead of, on a drum machine, instead of having a shuffle at 50-50, which is how much of the beat out of 100% is the shuffle. In a 50-50 shuffle is what we'd expect, like dun, 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 dun. But if you do an 80% shuffle, it's still in time, but it's dun 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 dun, dun. And it's just like it feels lopsided and weird, but people are playing with that now because it's like, well, it's math, but it's rhythm, and as long as it lands on the one, baby, that's all that matters, right? Right? George Clinton or James Brown, more appropriately, just the one, just land on the one, like Bootsy Collin. The one. As long as everyone's landing on the one, everything's good, baby. Do whatever you want up until then.
Yeah, and even if you got something like Cuban music, you don't even hit the one. You hit the one, and then you miss the next one, and then you get to one, right?
Yes.
So it's like, to me, that idea, just like if you keep people off balance rhythmically for little bits of time like that, and then return, it's that tension release thing again, right?
There we go. That's rhythmic tension. It's
rhythmic tension and release. That kind of thing just buys you so much. You take, like, that's why I love Cuban music so much. You take like just a 2-bar idea where it's off, and then lines up again, and then you start layering on top. It's gold. I mean,
but the very foundation is even offsetting. Just a clave. A clave is a setup and a deviation all in one, right? So if those not familiar with 3/2 clave would be like a Sorry. Yeah, that's right. So it's like you're setting something up, bump, 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 and then it's like offset at the same time, and that's the loop. The loop is some like offset kind of thing. But when you get between those rhythms, oh man, and dancing to a clave, once you can dance a clave, you understand dancing in rhythm in a way that I didn't before.
Right, but that's all it takes. Like Cuban music might sound really difficult, but if you just get into that one little door,
Yeah.
you're in. And it's the same thing with Indian music. If you understand the basic rhythmic cycles, frankly, if you understand one, you understand teen tal, and you understand why they're doing the clapping the way they're doing on stage, you'll understand why people are starting to get out of their seats at certain times and then getting back down and anticipating when these great moments are coming. And all of a sudden, the music opens up, you know? I think it's easier to become fluent in a music than it is in a language. And,
because it's easier to set the structure. You can set a structure and an expectation in music in a way that you can't in language, that people will be on board with you. By the time you do it twice, they're with you the third time. Right. And then there's the synchrony, right? So for instance, even in these conversations, the fact that we're doing this online and there's just a couple milliseconds of latency, it throws our rhythm off. If we were having this conversation person to person, it would. I mean, I still think I'm having a great conversation. I hope that you're enjoying it half as much as I am. But I think that if we were in person, it would be even more robust because we'd really be able to play off of each other's interactional rhythms. Right. And then we could play with that. We could agree with each other and enjoy that rhythm and then offset it by arguing with each other. And there's the tension and release in that interactional rhythm. So that's, so I think that you're getting the point of why I think tension and release is so much more of a fun way of looking at things, because you don't have to have a specific direction for it to go to, because what the release means to each individual once they've undergone the tension is up to them. That you've provided that catalyst, to me, is the magic. That's tapping into the wavelength of music making.
Right. You would probably like something that my students really hate. I often will.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I often will do some really surprising tension-filled chord progression at the piano, oftentimes like a jazz progression, instead of ending on that beautiful C major 7th chord and C major, I'll end on a D flat major 7th chord. And then I just pull away and they're sitting there like, no, you can't do that. I said, no, until you get all this stuff right on the board here, I can't resolve that.
Oh, that's
sometimes I never do because they don't get everything right. And they're feeling that tension. It's too much. It's too much.
Well, if you really want to bust their chops, you just just loop the shepherd's tone underneath it. Like it feels like it's never quite getting to its destination.
Tell me when it gets there. Tell me when it gets there. That's exactly.
All right, Lex. So I'm going to start wrapping this up, man. I really appreciate that you took some time to talk to me about this. We could have another whole conversation about food, and I may just hit you up for that.
Yeah, definitely. We could get into some molecular gastronomy. And also, I don't know if you know this, you must have known this, perhaps how you got to me and my father as well. But we wrote an article about music and food.
Yes.
Which was not about the combination of the two, but how perhaps our understanding of the two and structure in the two might be similar.
Yes. So when I interviewed you, Pop. So when I interviewed him, he mentioned you and your interests in food, because he and I got to talking about food and music, and he was just like, "Oh, you would love to talk to my son, Lex." That's exactly right, I would. And then I emailed you.
Yes.
So let's coordinate maybe something. Let's talk behind the scenes. Let's just wrap this up for here in front of everybody. Thank you, Lex, for showing up and talking and providing such great content. This was super fun.
I enjoyed this very much. So.
And Simon, you were fantastic. You were the best babysitter I've ever hired.
You asked the toughest question too.
Thank you so much, Lex. I really appreciate it. You made me laugh with that story at the end of not resolving things for your students.
That's me.
That's
torture.
And that example you used is such a McLaughlin thing to do as well. So I appreciate it. I appreciated it.
All right, so this is how I end most of these things. Let me just do this little thing. So this is part of a series that I like to do. My channel, I like to engage the theme of the dinner table, right? So it's my dinner table. Everyone's invited. I'll host, be my guest. I like to have conversations that increase everyone's quality of life. And even if it doesn't increase yours, it increases mine. And so even if you just have a window into me trying to use the internet in a way that increases my quality of life by having these kinds of conversations, I think it's still a win. I think that we still win at the end of the day. So I'm going to play the intro as the outro. Thank you everyone who decided to watch, who decided to comment, and I will see you the next time. She's got the flavor. She's got